Started feeling like I'm back in my damn mind. Started feeling like I'm rapping a damn lie. Started feeling like my life is a damn game. Nigga really wanna die in the night time. Only time I feel pain when I'm feeling low. So I said it on my face that I'm damn low. Only time on my mind when I'm all alone. That's why I'm never really alone in the night time.
Welcome back everybody to Keenan K TV. In today's video, I want to talk about the Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony El Cucuy Ferguson fight, but mainly focus on why Khabib Nurmagomedov could defeat Tony. I will be making a similar video where I talk about Tony defeating Khabib, so be sure to subscribe to stay notified for that one. Now with that being said, let's jump right into the video. So now we have Khabib coming off of his dominating victory over Dustin Poirier. We have to really look at Khabib and I really ask the question, where is he physically and where is he skill-wise and how much better can he really get? And in my opinion, right now after the fight with Dustin Poirier, Khabib is virtually at his very peak, the best that he could have ever been. Now what makes me say this? Obviously right now he's the world champion, defeated Conor, became world champion, defended against the interim world champion in Dustin Poirier, looked dominant in all those matchups and made even the very best of the division look just like another victim to the Khabib Nurmagomedov smash. Now aside from those wins, if you take a look at Khabib, right now he is currently in his prime. He has been making weight without a problem for the last 1.5 years, 2 years. Currently he's what, 30 years old, 31 years old, so in terms of like the prime years of a fighter, he's also at that very point in his life. And for us to have this version of Khabib, it is very important going into a fight against potentially his toughest fight to date. At least on paper, Tony Ferguson is that guy. He is the guy that will put Khabib in arguably his toughest test. Now for Khabib to go into a fight like that, you really have to hope that he is going to be ready against an opponent like that. And right now he's more than ready. If they were to fight the first time around or the second time around, in my opinion, Khabib is not as good as he was back then as he is currently today. And if we are going to be looking at Tony Ferguson, Tony right now is 35 years old, and I would have to say that within the next year, maybe year and a half, we will start to see Tony Ferguson start to a little bit decline in his performances. That's just how it goes naturally. As you get older, you get a bit slower, a bit weaker physically, your reaction time starts to slow down, and that's just, you know, father time. You cannot really change much about that. And now what I'm trying to say is this: the more time that passes by, the more it will play into Khabib's favor. The better that Khabib will become, and I would have to assume worse Tony Ferguson will get. But when it comes to Tony Ferguson, his style really is somewhat of a fighting style that will just get better over time. He is not a certain fighter who really depends on his physical attributes, right? He does not really depend on his youth in regards of, you have fighters who are very dependent on their reflexes, right? Who are hands low, reflexes, quick fastness, speed, power, everything to that extent. Some fighters are like that, but when it comes to Tony, he's a very well thought out, pretty balanced fighter who uses his physical advantages to his absolute favor. And to conclude this part of the video, what I'm trying to say is that Khabib right now is at his very best. Physically, mentally, and in terms of skill, Khabib is at his very peak. And I would have to believe that is not going to be hurting him in the slightest going into a fight with Tony Ferguson. Now speaking of which, it is time for us to talk about why Khabib Nurmagomedov could defeat Tony Ferguson. Now from the get-go, I would have to really establish the fact that this fight can go 5 rounds without a problem. We have Tony Ferguson, who is a cardio freak. We have Khabib Nurmagomedov, who in his own right is also a very great endurance fighter. So when it comes down to it, we don't really have a certain scenario where, for example, against Conor McGregor, in round 3, 4, and 5, we really could not see Khabib losing to Conor. But in this matchup, you don't see either guy losing if we bring the championship rounds into the conversation. So with that established, it will really have to come down to how both of their skill sets will fare up against one another. Now, like any other Khabib Nurmagomedov opponent fight breakdown, it is usually going to come down to a striker versus a grappler, which is obviously him. Now Khabib is a certain fighter who right now is in a position where his own grappling skills have come to a point where they're not necessarily in there to compete with someone like Tony Ferguson. But what he does so greatly is the fact that he can just mesh that entire striking game and make it work for his grappling game. Now with Tony Ferguson, he's a fighter that kind of already plays into, I would say, the weaknesses in Khabib's striking game, which is something that comes to the fact that Khabib is a fighter who could, easily take the outside of the octagon and he could get himself backed up against a cage. And when it comes to Tony Ferguson, For one, he's not a fighter that will overthrow his punches. He is a very good calculated fighter. He does not overextend on his punches. He does not overextend on his kicks. He is a fighter who can really manipulate the distance, the pace, and he can really make you overthink and freeze up. And if Khabib is going to be going into a fight where he's backing up against Tony Ferguson from the opening of the fight, that is already not a good way to start in this matchup. However, I would have to believe that Tony Ferguson, he has not seen someone like Khabib Nurmagomedov's pedigree of grappling, of wrestling. So why that would play a factor in this matchup is the fact that in any other Khabib Nurmagomedov fight, the wrestling threat, the grappling threat is always there. It's always luring, and fighters, they cannot really get into their own game because of it. And Tony Ferguson, I would have to believe that he is a fighter who mentally is not going to be faced by that, but he's not a dumb fighter and he cannot really neglect that part of Khabib's game. Coming back to the striking game, in my opinion, Khabib has something that a lot of people in the division kind of struggle with, right? It is the fact that he is a fighter who will rarely walk into a bait, walk into a trap. For example, against Conor McGregor, even after being like backed up for the majority of the success that Conor had on Khabib, you know, if you could even call that, he never really took a bait. He never really walked himself into a trap. Against Dustin Poirier, the same thing can be implied. Other than the right hand that landed, virtually no other success was there. And if you're going into a fight with Tony Ferguson, who is a great pressure fighter, the footwork that Khabib possesses and the patience is already a good way to start. Khabib is not a fighter who is just come forward all the time, like for example Ben Askren is. He is more than comfortable being backed up, and it's not uncharted territories. So in that regard, we can say that okay, Tony Ferguson, that may be his advantage, but Khabib also knows how to fight from that situation. Now let's focus a bit more on Khabib's offensive striking game. I've just focused a lot more on Khabib's defense because that is really what drives his entire game forward. When it comes to Khabib's own striking offense, it has come a long way as well. Right now, his punches look very snappy, fast, great technique. He knows what he's doing. And his opponent, Tony Ferguson, he's not really the defensive genius of the division, right? I mean, come on, let's be real about it right now. He is a fighter that has a lot of openings, and his best defense is his offense. So he is a very hittable target. Like most of his opponents were able to hit him, Tony Ferguson, however, has great recovering abilities. He has a great chin. He can take a hit. Even if he gets knocked down, he has never gotten knocked out before. And when it comes to Khabib, I do expect him to be able to land his jabs, his overhands maybe as well, because Tony's chin is always exposed in the air and he's really just there to be hit. However, it really comes down to the fact that Tony Ferguson rarely gives his opponents the time to hit him. He's always active and he's always throwing. So when it comes to Khabib, if he's going to be using his footwork, his momentum, and if he's not going to be a stationary target, he for one will be taking that momentum, that pace, that output away from Tony Ferguson, and that will already create a bit more of a, let's just say, slower pace from Tony Ferguson. And given the fact that he is somewhat of a hittable target, and Khabib Nurmagomedov is a pretty fast fighter and also pretty powerful, we cannot really rule out Khabib's success in the striking department as well. Now, with that success in the striking department, that will automatically transfer over to the grappling department, the wrestling game, because Khabib is a very great fighter at transitioning and striking to his grappling seamlessly. You never really know when he's going to shoot, but you do know that he will shoot on you. So when that time comes and he does shoot on you, for example, Tony Ferguson, he has gotten taken down by Kevin Lee, and pretty much whenever Kevin Lee did want to take him down, he was pretty much successful doing so. Now obviously these two are not the same, but if you can imagine Khabib who can have striking success, back Tony up, pin him against the cage, and if he then goes for a takedown, it is pretty hard to envision Khabib not being able to get it. I mean, nobody in my opinion can defend from a Khabib Nurmagomedov cage takedown. That's just how I see it. Tony Ferguson is no different. And once he gets taken down, it will come down to when the takedown and when the grappling game starts. If it's the first 2 rounds, I would have to expect that we will see just a very slow, methodical approach that will slowly build damage upon Tony Ferguson. Similarly to what we saw against Edson Barboza, Conor McGregor, even Dustin Poirier, right? Khabib is not somebody that will overdo it. And Tony Ferguson, when he fought Kevin Lee, he had somebody who was just overdoing the ground and pound, who was just overworking himself. Khabib doesn't do that. He's very smart and he knows against Tony Ferguson, this will be a long night. Given the fact that he's already a pretty patient grappler on the top, he's going to be even more patient and even more methodical than ever. And when it comes to Tony Ferguson and his grappling, a lot of people talk about his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu skills, his overall grappling skills off of the back, and I would have to say they are very impressive. He is a very creative grappler that will always look for a finish. He will always try to set up a certain submission and just get you out of there. And against Khabib Nurmagomedov, I would have to say, sure, that's obviously something that we haven't seen in a long while, if ever. However, when you do get taken out by Khabib, you usually end up getting taken down by the fence. And if your back is up against the fence, Khabib can be very smooth in taking your back from there as well. So whether your back is up against the cage and Khabib is landing half-powered ground and pound on you, or he's just taking his time and pinning you against the cage, you can be very sure that whatever you do in that situation, you're not really going to be having a lot of success, because Khabib is already going to be sitting on your knees, he's going to be locking your legs, and you're going to be a very immobile fighter from the bottom. So even if your name happens to be Tony Ferguson, you're not going to be doing much in that certain situation, and that is a position that almost every one of Khabib's opponents end up in. You will rarely see Khabib taking his opponents down in the middle of the octagon and keeping them down in the middle of the octagon. He is always keeping them against the cage, and he's always keeping them in a situation where they either have to worry about their balance or posting up or not getting hit. So the opponent rarely has time to worry about, oh, how will I be able to set up a submission from this position, because it rarely gets to that point. Now at this point, Khabib has Tony on the mat, he's on top, he's controlling Tony. At what point can we really expect a definitive outcome for this fight? How would that outcome be like? And right now, if you think about it, Tony Ferguson, I would have to assume that he will not really get tired up until maybe the 4th and 5th round. So assuming that, this fight will probably have to end by submission for Khabib Nurmagomedov, or a TKO, whatever it may be. So if Khabib is going to be winning this fight, this is how he could win. Most likely, right? Most likely he will get a submission win over Tony Ferguson. But if it does not come down to that, I would have to say that a decision victory is pretty much guaranteed by that point already. Now with all of this said, I talked about how and why Khabib Nurmagomedov could defeat Tony Ferguson. I will talk about Tony Ferguson defeating Khabib, so be sure to subscribe to stay notified for that video as well. Now, ultimately in the end, only time will tell what will really happen. For now, I have been Keenan from Keenan KTV. Leave who you guys think will win come fight night in the comment section down below, and I am signing off. Later.